February of 1944. The air over Western Europe trembled under the thunder of engines. Beneath the cold grey clouds, a formation of stubby-winged fighters carved contrails across the sky, each leaving a thin white scar that stretched toward the horizon. The pilots inside could barely hear their own thoughts over the roar of turbines. Sweat froze on their brows as oxygen hissed through cracked masks. Somewhere below, German soldiers looked up and wondered what kind of machine could climb like that. They called it der fliegende Fass, the flying barrel, and soon its shadow would darken their every road and rail line. At first glance, the aircraft looked ungainly, almost comic. Short fuselage, wide intake, and a jet engine that seemed too loud for its size. Yet in the hands of Allied pilots, it became a scythe in the sky. As the sun broke through the clouds, silver reflections glinted off its canopy, revealing a pilot barely in his 20s, jaw set, eyes fixed on the specks of movement far below. The radio crackled, coordinates confirmed. In seconds, the young man rolled, inverted, and plunged toward the earth, his machine howling as if alive. The target, a German armored convoy moving east of the Rhine. Wind screamed against metal. Flak bursts dotted the sky, black flowers blooming in lethal rhythm. The pilot pressed the trigger, and the air filled with the heavy bark of 20mm cannons. Trucks exploded, fuel burned bright as daylight, and the column dissolved into chaos. Behind him, 2 more flying barrels followed, their exhausts leaving glowing trails. To the soldiers on the ground, it seemed like the end had arrived on wings. Minutes later, the valley was silent except for the crackle of burning fuel. The squadron regrouped at altitude, each pilot scanning for survivors, each heart pounding from adrenaline and disbelief. In just 10 months, aircraft like these would obliterate more than 86,000 targets, trains, tanks, convoys, depots, crippling Germany's ability to move and fight. No propaganda could hide what was happening. The war machine of the Reich was being dismantled from above. High over the smoke, the pilot exhaled slowly. He thought of home, of the letters unread, of faces fading behind memory. His instruments flickered, reminding him that the mission wasn't over. More sorties waited, more tracks to hunt. Below, the fields of Europe burned with the proof that a new kind of warfare had arrived. The flying barrel had proven itself not as a curiosity, but as vengeance made of steel and flame. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had become an unforgiving battlefield. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's empire, was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The Allies had achieved air superiority in many regions, but at a terrible cost. For every raid on German industry, dozens of bombers failed to return. The long, treacherous daylight raids on cities like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen exposed the vulnerability of heavy bombers without fast, reliable escorts. German fighters, Messerschmitt, Bf 109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s, still prowled the upper air, waiting like wolves for the next wave of American B-17s and B-24s to lumber into view. The Allies needed a weapon that could change the tempo of the air war, something faster, stronger, and capable of turning the tide from defense to destruction. In Britain, engineers at Gloucester Aircraft Company were working on a revolutionary concept, a jet-powered fighter that could break through the limitations of piston engines. Across the Channel, Germany had already tested its own jets, the Messerschmitt Me 262s, which boasted speeds the Allies could barely imagine. But while the Germans were obsessed with creating a high-speed interceptor to protect their cities, the Allies saw the potential of jets for something else: relentless ground attack. What emerged from this vision would be a squat, brutal-looking aircraft known as the Gloucester Meteor. Though among troops and pilots alike, its rounded bodies soon earned it a different name: the flying barrel. It was not elegant, but it was efficient. And in war, efficiency kills. The idea of using speed as both weapon and shield fascinated military strategists. Jet propulsion meant that the Meteor could approach its target before enemy gunners even registered its presence. Its twin engines, Rolls-Royce Derwent turbines, produced a distinctive shriek, a sound that terrified soldiers long before they saw the aircraft itself. For the first time, the Allies could send aircraft deep into contested territory with minimal warning for the enemy. The Luftwaffe radar network, already strained, struggled to track these new arrivals. The psychological impact alone was immense. German soldiers nicknamed it the Whispering Death, though in truth, it was anything but silent. On the ground, Allied command recognized that destroying Germany's supply network would be just as vital as winning in the air. The Red Ball Express, a fleet of American supply trucks, fed the Allied advance through France, but the Germans had their own vast logistical web, stretching from the Ruhr industrial heartland to the front lines in the east. Every bridge, every train, every road mattered, and the Flying Barrel was about to become the most efficient saboteur of them all. Assigned to low-level attack missions, it would sweep down on columns, rails, and fuel depots with devastating precision, striking faster than artillery and vanishing into the clouds before retaliation could arrive. Its pilots were not seasoned veterans. Many were barely out of training, drawn by the promise of flying something entirely new. They came from the RAF and the Royal Australian Air Force, carrying the same mixture of excitement and dread that accompanies all technological leaps in wartime. In mess halls, they joked nervously about the jet's design, the stubby fuselage, the strange lack of a propeller. But when the first combat reports came in, when photographs showed convoys reduced to twisted metal, the laughter stopped. The Meteor's baptism of fire had been brief but decisive. For the first time, Allied pilots had a weapon that could truly dictate the terms of engagement. Strategically, the Meteor's emergence coincided with a broader shift in Allied thinking. By mid-1944, the emphasis had moved from pure air dominance to total mobility denial, ensuring the German army could neither move nor supply itself effectively. Bridges became as valuable as tanks. Trains became as deadly as any gun emplacement. Every sortie flown by the Flying Barrel was part of a greater design to starve the Wehrmacht of fuel, ammunition, and time. Behind the numbers, 86,000 confirmed ground targets destroyed within 10 months, lay a campaign of relentless precision. The aircraft did not seek glory in dogfights. It existed to erase the enemy's ability to fight at all. Inside the Allied planning room, officers pored over reconnaissance photos, tracing lines of supply and columns of smoke. The effectiveness of the Meteor stunned even its creators. While the Luftwaffe poured its dwindling fuel reserves into defending the skies, the Allies attacked the arteries that kept Germany alive. Every destroyed locomotive, every burning convoy meant fewer reinforcements reaching the front. The German war machine, once unstoppable, began to suffocate under its own weight. And the Flying Barrel, that strange, stubby machine, was tightening the noose. Still, the jet was far from perfect. Early models had limited range and unstable flight characteristics at high speed. Pilots reported engine surges, unpredictable fuel consumption, and even compressor stalls during dives. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, often in freezing conditions, to keep the machines airworthy. Yet for every technical flaw, the Meteor offered one undeniable advantage. It could not be caught. German propeller-driven fighters had no hope of intercepting it once it built up speed. The hunter had become the hunted, and the psychological reversal rippled through the Luftwaffe like a virus. By autumn of 1944, the Flying Barrel had transitioned from experimental project to operational legend. Its squadrons became ghosts that haunted supply lines from France to the Netherlands. Allied newspapers celebrated it as a symbol of modern warfare, though few civilians understood the cost paid by its young pilots. For every successful sortie, another crew failed to return, victims of flak, mechanical failure, or simple misfortune. Yet their missions carved deep scars into the landscape of Europe, scars that would take decades to heal. And while history would remember the Meteor as a marvel of engineering, for those who flew it, it was something else entirely, a fragile promise that perhaps, with enough speed, the war could finally end. The winter of 1944 pressed hard against Europe, and with it came the sound of engines that seemed to split the air itself. In a small airfield tucked away in Lincolnshire, young pilots of the Royal Air Force prepared for what would become the most aggressive ground attack campaign of the war. They had spent weeks studying maps, memorizing supply routes, and rehearsing attack runs over frozen fields that mimicked the terrain of occupied France. The hangars smelled of oil and frost. the floor stained with the footprints of men who knew that every sortie might be their last. Mechanics huddled beneath the wings of their machines, tightening bolts with gloved hands numb from the cold. The flying barrel, once treated as a curiosity, was now a weapon of necessity. Each morning began before sunrise. The fog clung to the airfield like a living thing, swallowing the sound of boots on gravel. In the briefing room, cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling as commanding officers outlined targets. Bridges, rail line, convoys. A red grease pencil traced lines across maps, each one representing both a mission and a risk. Some pilots stared silently at the paper. Others whispered nervous jokes to mask the dread that came with flying low and fast over enemy territory. The jet was quick, but flak was quicker, and every descent below 1,000 feet meant stepping into the crosshairs of German gunners. Yet none hesitated. They had been given something powerful, and in war, power leaves no room for doubt. By February, the Meteor squadrons had integrated new tactics. They flew in pairs, one to strike, one to cover, a deadly ballet performed at 450 miles per hour. The first aircraft would dive toward the target, unleashing cannon fire and rockets, while the second circled above, scanning for interceptors or incoming fire. Coordination was crucial. In training, they practiced over and over, using empty fields and dummy targets, timing each maneuver down to the second. Pilots spoke of feeling like they were learning to fight all over again. The jet's acceleration was violent, the controls heavier, and the reaction time shorter than any plane before it. The men who mastered it became something new, the first generation of jet warriors. Behind the airfield, the maintenance sheds buzzed with life. Engineers and ground crews worked day and night, replacing engines, recalibrating instruments, and sealing fuel leaks. The Derwent turbines, while powerful, were delicate creatures, prone to flameouts if handled roughly. Every sortie carried the risk of mechanical failure, yet the crews pushed forward, driven by the belief that speed itself was now the Allies' greatest ally. One mechanic described the sound of a Meteor engine igniting as a scream from the future, eerie, mechanical, almost alive. When the turbine spooled up, conversation stopped, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The jet had become a symbol of transition, a bridge between old war and new. At command headquarters, Allied strategists watched the situation in Western Europe with mounting urgency. The German army was retreating, but not broken. Its logistical network, though battered, still pulsed with life. Trains carried munitions through the night, armored divisions regrouped along the Rhine, and fuel depots fed the final defensive lines. To win, the Allies needed to strangle this network completely. The flying barrel was chosen for that purpose. Its speed allowed it to evade interception, its cannons could tear apart armored columns, and its compact design made it ideal for low-level strikes. In theory, it was the perfect hunter. In practice, it demanded nerves of steel. The pilots were briefed about the nature of their new role. Not glamorous dogfighting, but surgical annihilation. They were to erase the enemy's ability to move, not merely to fight. Convoys, depots, fuel lines, anything that moved or burned became a target. Many struggled with the moral weight of such missions. They knew that when fuel trucks exploded, the men inside rarely stood a chance. But war did not permit reflection. Hesitation was a luxury none could afford. They flew because they were told to, and because they believed that every destroyed supply line brought the war closer to its end. The flying barrel, in their hands, was both a tool of liberation and destruction. In letters home, the young airmen rarely spoke of what they saw. They wrote instead of weather, food, and the monotonous rhythm of base life. But between the lines, their words carried exhaustion. The endless sorties, the tension of flying just above treetops, the sight of smoke columns stretching for miles. These became their daily reality. Many developed rituals before takeoff. A cigarette smoked in silence, a photo kissed and tucked into a pocket, a quick glance toward the sky as if asking permission. Some came back and joked about their luck. Others didn't come back at all. The empty chairs in the mess hall said what words could not. March brought longer days and clearer skies, perfect for hunting. Reports from the front confirmed the jet's effectiveness. German trains carrying ammunition were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel convoys burned before reaching the front. Bridges collapsed under the weight of precision strikes. The Meteor squadrons were rewriting the rules of air warfare, proving that dominance was no longer a matter of altitude, but of speed and surprise. Newspapers back home began calling the aircraft the Lightning of Europe, but the pilots preferred a simpler description: fast enough to live. Each flight was a gamble between glory and oblivion. There were still doubts among the older officers. Some believed the jet's technology was advancing too quickly for human reflexes to keep pace. Others feared its fuel consumption made it impractical for long campaigns. But the results spoke for themselves. In 10 months, the Flying Barrel would record more confirmed ground kills than any single type of aircraft in Allied service. It was rewriting the balance of fear. The Luftwaffe, once so proud, found itself powerless against a weapon it could not counter. German pilots began to dread the faint shriek that preceded a meteor's attack, a sound that meant their world was about to vanish in flame and dust. As the spring of 1944 turned to summer, the pilots grew harder, quieter. They no longer flinched at flak or cursed the engine's quirks. They simply flew. The missions blended together, one burning column of trucks after another, one shattered bridge replaced by the next. Yet behind their discipline burned a private understanding. They were witnessing the birth of a new age of warfare, one that would not end with them. The Flying Barrel was more than a machine. It was a glimpse of what was coming. And though none could say it aloud, many sensed that when this war ended, a new and far greater one was already waiting beyond the horizon of technology. By May 1944, the airfields of southern England pulsed with a restless energy. Pilots moved like men walking through a dream, their eyes always on the horizon, their bodies trapped between exhaustion and anticipation. Every briefing now felt heavier, each sortie more dangerous than the last. The Germans had begun to adapt, positioning flak batteries near bridges and using decoy convoys to lure the meteors into traps. But the jet's speed made deception futile. By the time the gunners sighted them, the attack was already over. Smoke and debris marked where the Flying Barrels had been. The war had become a contest of reactions. Who could see, think, and strike first? And the jet had turned that contest into slaughter. At night, when missions were done and the engines finally silent, the airfields carried an uneasy calm. The men gathered in dimly lit rooms, cups of bitter coffee in hand, and stared at mission boards filled with red marks. Each mark was a loss. A name erased from the roster, another empty bunk in the barracks. No one spoke of fear, but it hung there, thick as the oil-stained air. Outside, the mechanics worked under the pale glow of lanterns, patching bullet holes, checking turbines, and painting kill tallies beneath cockpit glass. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like routine, but those who were there understood that every sortie was part of something far larger. An invisible hand tightening around Germany's throat. June came with storms that turned the skies into chaos. Missions were delayed, then resumed under heavy cloud cover. Flying through rain and wind at jet speed tested both nerves and machinery to the breaking point. Many pilots described losing all sense of direction. The horizon vanished, instruments flickered, and the only constant was the vibration of the engines. Yet through the turbulence, they pressed on, guided by instinct more than sight. Below them, convoys still moved, trains still rolled, and somewhere across those darkened roads, a war machine still tried to resist. The Flying Barrel was no longer just an aircraft. It was persistence itself, roaring through storms, defying gravity, and carving its legacy into the clouds of Europe. Dawn broke over northern France like a blade of light cutting through fog. The fields below shimmered with dew, untouched for now, but not for long. From the English coast, a formation of 6 Flying Barrels lifted into the pale morning sky, their twin turbines screaming against the silence. Their mission: to strike a heavily defended railway junction near Lille, a vital artery feeding the German front. The men inside those jets barely spoke. Each knew his task. Each knew what failure would mean: trains that would continue to roll, guns that would keep firing, and comrades on the ground who would pay the price. The leader, squadron leader, James Cooper, glanced at his watch. 0542. The day had begun. Crossing the channel took less than 10 minutes. Beneath them, the water flashed silver and black as clouds drifted apart. Radar stations tracked their movement, but by the time the Germans registered the blips, the meteors were already inland. Cooper's voice came through the radio, calm but sharp. "Stay low. Keep formation. No second run." Ahead, the railway lines curved like black veins through green fields, leading straight into the smoking heart of the industrial zone. The jets dropped to treetop height, engines howling as they picked up speed. The world blurred. Houses flashed by. Church steeples whipped past the canopy. And then, the first burst of flak erupted from the ground, black puffs of death against the morning sun. The lead jet fired first. A ripple of cannon shells tore through the air, shattering boxcars and sending sparks across the tracks. Explosions rippled outward, engulfing fuel tanks and locomotives in orange fire. One by one, the meteors dove in, each releasing rockets that screamed into the junction below. The air became a storm of metal and smoke. German gunners scrambled to respond, but the jets were already gone, streaking past at speeds their old 20mm cannons couldn't track. By the time the last aircraft pulled up, the target was gone, replaced by a rolling inferno. Cooper's squadron climbed back into the clouds, engines trembling under strain, hearts pounding with the knowledge that they had just witnessed something new. Total destruction in seconds. Their return to base was quiet. No cheers, no celebration, only exhaustion. The footage from the gun cameras told the story better than words. Trains reduced to twisted iron, fuel depots burning for hours, and hundreds of tons of enemy supplies wiped from the map. The mission was a success, but it carried a heavy price. One jet failed to return. Pilot Officer Green, last seen diving through the smoke, his radio silent. The squadron waited through the night, hoping for news. None came. In war, absence became its own kind of confirmation. His locker remained untouched for days, the smell of oil and tobacco clinging to his jacket like a ghost. As the campaign expanded, the flying barrels were deployed deeper into occupied territory. Belgium, Holland, Western Germany. No region was beyond reach. The Allies now used intelligence from intercepted radio messages and reconnaissance flights to locate key transport routes. Whenever a major supply line was identified, the meteors were called in. The results were always the same: smoke, silence, and fear. German commanders began referring to the aircraft as Der Graue Tod, the Grey Death, because it struck without warning and vanished just as quickly. Villagers along the routes spoke of the strange new aircraft that came from the clouds like thunder, leaving destruction in its wake. To many, it seemed less like a machine and more like a sign that the war's end was near. Every mission blurred into the next. Pilots learned to read the land as hunters read tracks. The glint of rails, the shadow of a truck convoy, the telltale flash of a fuel dump. They spoke little during flights. Their coordination had become instinctive. One look, one hand signal, and the formation adjusted. There was no time to think. Each attack was over before it began. The human brain could barely keep pace with the machine's velocity, and yet they adapted. It was no longer about skill alone, but about surrendering to the aircraft's rhythm, trusting the engines, trusting speed, trusting fate. War had turned them into extensions of their machines, and the line between man and metal was fading fast. By August, the meteors were operating almost daily. Reports from the front confirmed what Allied commanders had only hoped for. Germany's logistics network was collapsing. Entire divisions were left stranded without fuel or ammunition. Trains that once carried reinforcements now lay in twisted heaps across rail yards. The once proud Wehrmacht was being starved into paralysis, not by bombs dropped from high altitude, but by precision strikes from these new predators of the air. The flying barrel had become the embodiment of modern war, fast, mechanical, relentless. Its pilots were writing a new doctrine, one that future generations of aviators would study long after the smoke cleared from Europe. But victory had its cost. The relentless sorties pushed both men and machines to their limits. The turbines overheated, airframes cracked under stress, and fuel supplies thinned as missions increased. Fatigue gnawed at the pilots like an invisible enemy. Some began to make mistakes, small ones at first, then fatal. A misjudged dive, a clipped tree, a moment of disorientation in low cloud. Each loss was a reminder that speed was both weapon and danger. Still, they flew. The thought of slowing down felt worse than death itself. In their hearts, they believed that the faster they struck, the sooner it would all end, and perhaps they too could finally rest. The deeper the Allies pushed into Europe, the more desperate the German defenses became. Along the Rhine, convoys began to move only at night, their headlights blacked out, their drivers terrified of the sound of turbines in the distance. Entire platoons were ordered to camouflage bridges with tree branches, hoping to hide them from the roaming eyes above. But it was futile. The flying barrel needed no moonlight to hunt. Equipped with new radar-assisted targeting and trained to follow road networks like bloodstreams, the jets struck with frightening accuracy. At dawn, towns awoke to the sound of distant explosions, the horizon glowing with the light of burning fuel. What began as a military campaign had become something more, an unrelenting dismantling of an empire's mobility. In September 1944, during what became known as the Siege of Arnhem, the flying barrels were tasked with cutting off German reinforcements, attempting to reach the Dutch front. For 3 days straight, they attacked without pause, flying low through mist and smoke, strafing columns of trucks and armored cars along narrow roads. The Luftwaffe tried to intercept them, but by the time the German fighters arrived, the meteors were gone, leaving only wreckage behind. One British officer later wrote that the sound of their engines was like hearing the future scream through the sky. German survivors spoke of panic, of drivers abandoning vehicles and running for cover as the jets descended like hawks. In those 3 days, more than 900 enemy vehicles were destroyed, a record that would never be matched again. By October, the legend of the flying barrel had spread across both sides of the front. Allied soldiers cheered whenever they saw the stubby jets roaring overhead, knowing that somewhere beyond the smoke, another enemy column had been erased. But the pilots themselves remained wary of praise. They had seen too much, lost too many friends to believe in glory. They spoke instead of the silence after an attack. That strange, haunting quiet when the guns stopped and only fire remained. Some confessed to hearing echoes long after landing, phantom screams that followed them into their sleep. War had turned them into instruments of destruction. Yet behind every mission, behind every burned convoy, they carried the same fragile thought, that maybe this terrible efficiency was the price of peace. By late autumn, the weather turned brutal. Ice coated the runway, and the cold seeped into everything, engines, bones, and hearts alike. Pilots now flew through storms that blurred the line between life and death. The sound of turbines screamed against the wind as they dived through clouds dense with snow, hunting convoys that crawled along the frozen highways below. Radio chatter crackled with half-heard words, drowned out by static and thunder. Even so, they pressed on, their eyes fixed on the faint glow of burning fuel in the distance. Each sortie felt like a fight against the world itself, against the cold, the exhaustion, and the invisible weight of time closing in on them all. The flying barrel had become both weapon and willpower, a machine that refused to surrender even when its pilots could barely stand. On November 19th, a mission near the Ruhr Valley changed everything. Intelligence had located a massive German fuel depot hidden within an industrial complex, camouflaged to appear abandoned. 6 meteors took off before dawn, flying low to avoid radar. They reached the target in minutes, engines howling as the first bombs fell. The explosion that followed tore through the valley like an earthquake. Witnesses described a mushroom of black smoke rising miles into the air, followed by shockwaves that shattered windows in nearby towns. For hours, the sky burned red. The depot's destruction crippled Germany's last armored divisions, tanks that would never move again. In that moment, the flying barrel became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of inevitability. The sound of its engines now meant the war was ending, but victory always carried a shadow. Of the 6 pilots who left that morning, only 4 returned. 2 vanished without a trace, lost in the smoke, the chaos, or perhaps the cold embrace of the clouds. Their names were written on the hangar wall in quiet ceremony that night. No speeches, no music, only silence and the smell of oil. Those who remained stood beneath the stars, their faces dimly lit by the lanterns of the maintenance crew. They had done their duty, and the world would soon know peace again. But for them, the price of that peace had already been paid. In the distance, the last echoes of the Ruhr explosions faded, leaving behind only the steady whisper of the wind through empty skies. When the war finally drew to a close in May 1945, the skies above Europe fell silent for the first time in years. The flying barrel squadrons, once symbols of unstoppable momentum, now stood motionless on muddy airfields. Mechanics wiped down their fuselages one last time, oil-streaked hands tracing the scars of battle across metal skin. The pilots who had once roared into the clouds now walked among rows of grounded aircraft, unsure what to do with the quiet. Some spoke of relief, others only of exhaustion. They had lived for the next mission, the next flight, the next order, and now there were none. The engines cooled. The war was over, but the memory of what those machines had done and what they had cost would echo far longer than the sound of their turbine. Reports compiled months later revealed the staggering scale of destruction. In just 10 months of operation, the Flying Barrel had destroyed more than 86,000 enemy targets. Convoys, trains, bridges, and depots that once fueled the Nazi war machine. Historians would later call it one of the most efficient aerial campaigns ever conducted. But within those numbers were lives, drivers who never made it home, soldiers who vanished in fire and steel, civilians caught in the wake of a storm they could neither see nor understand. War records written in tidy ink could never capture the chaos of those skies or the trembling hands that gripped the controls. For every target struck, there was a heartbeat silenced, a truth the men of the Flying Barrel Squadron carried with them long after the medals were pinned. In the years that followed, the aircraft itself became a relic, displayed in museums, painted fresh, admired by schoolchildren who would never smell the burnt oil or feel the tremor of its engine beneath their boots. Veterans would stand beside it during commemorations, their uniforms faded, their eyes distant. When asked about the plane, they would smile faintly and say it was fast, too fast for its time, but beneath the smile lived something else. The memory of youth lost to the sky, of comrades who never landed. The Flying Barrel had changed the war, and in doing so, it had changed them. They had stared into history's fire and come out the other side, older, quieter, and forever marked by the sound of a jet that once screamed through the heart of war. If stories like this move you, stories of courage, innovation, and sacrifice, then stay with us. Each week, we uncover another moment where ordinary men faced impossible odds and changed the course of history. Subscribe to the channel and step back into the sky, the trenches, and the battles that shaped our world. Because the past isn't gone. It still whispers through the echoes of engines, the rust of forgotten weapons, and the memories of those who lived it. This is WW2 Revisited, where history lives again.